Yeah.
I got it. Thank you. I just need someone else staring over my shoulder, so I screwed it up. Okay. All right. You're at the beginning. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is IETF117. This is the DHCP working group meeting. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Bernie is remote. He is online and can hear everything we're talking about. But on that note, please make sure that if you're making comments in the room that you go to the microphone so that both Bernie and I can hear them. That'd be great. Thank you. Here's the note. Well, please, we're here to follow all of the rules of the IETF. Please read this if you haven't seen it. I know it's Monday. Please take the time to read this and follow everything in it. Thanks. Meet Echo for the blue sheets. Please, if you're in the room, don't forget to sign in. We want to get attendance correctly. There's a clipboard with the QR code. Just pass it around to everybody. Lorenzo's going to hold it up. Just take a photo of it. It's perfect. Note takers, Bernie's going to try to take some notes, and we also have Ben from the IOL. Ben Patton's agreed to take some notes. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Bernie. Yeah. So today's agenda, we're going to do chair stuff for the first 5 minutes. Then Jen's going to talk about self-generated IPv6 addresses. Then we're going to do 8415. And last, we're going to do next steps. Anyone have anything they want to add or change to that while we're here? All right. DHC working group status. So we have 2 working group documents. We've had one more than we had last time when we met. At the last IETF, we only had 8415 biz. We've added the self-generated notifications, which Jen's going to talk about today, so that's perfect. One draft that I wanted to mention here is the SR6 locator draft. Has been presented twice to this group, and during the last IETF, we talked about that potentially moving to spring, and that's what's happened. It's moved over to the spring group. So if you were really wondering where that draft went, that's where it is now. That's where the work's being done. So please go there to track it if you're interested in what's going on. Obviously, we'll keep an eye on it and do reviews of it, but we think it's better there. It's just a different option, basically. So that's why we moved that over. Here's a couple of related documents that we've had for a little bit of time. We like to just throw these in here so that people are aware. They're not working group documents, but people should know what's going on. So there's 3 of them there we've added. If there are more, feel free to send them to either the DHCP list or just us beforehand. Obviously, we're a working group that has lots of groups who depend on DHCP, so we can't track them all. And that's it. That's all we have on the chair slide. So Jen, you're up. Yeah, I can do it.
Hello, I'm Jen. As usual, we talk about self-generated, registered self-generated IP addresses using DHCP6. The draft has been adopted since last IETF. Next slide, please. Well, next slide, please. So what changed? First of all, thank you for everyone who read it again and provided comments. What we did for reply message, we changed it from being optional to being non-optional. So server should respond when they get a registration message. The client must stop retransmitting as soon as it gets a reply. Obviously, the client cannot rely on reply to arrive because client could not know if the server supports it or not. Also, we renamed that message to add reg reply to be consistent with add reg inform. So next slide, please. It's going to be a quick talk. I realized that we have not clarified transaction ID. It was nothing in the draft about that, but it looks like it's a kind of mandatory part of the message. So some text has been added to say that client, I think the text is currently consistent with 8415. So client generates a transaction ID when it sends a message. It uses the same transaction ID for a transmit, but generates a new transaction ID when it does a refresh after some time. and the server use received transaction ID when sends reply. On the other hand, neither client nor server does anything about transaction ID. So it's kind of useless, but I think the draft should have some text about how to fill it. So I don't have an opinion how useful it is. Also, the actual question is, should or may or must, I don't know, server do anything about transaction ID? Because one option would be to say that server may or should ignore logging duplicated messages, right? So let's say server receives three retransmits with the same transaction ID. What should the server do? It could log all of them, process them independently without keeping any state, or the server may ignore repeated like retransmit, or may just do, I don't know, something like syslog does, saying this message has been repeated 25 times, right? So suggestions are welcome. So currently there is nothing in the draft about any actions or action on transaction ID. It just, the text is currently just saying how to populate that field, and that's it. Next slide, please.
Do you want, Bernie has something to say. You want him to wait for him? Yeah, go ahead, Bernie.
Yeah, I was going to say that, the transaction ID, while, the server could use it, as you indicated, the transaction ID is most useful for the client because, if it starts to transmit this notification, and then, for example, it assigns a new ID because it's starting a totally new transaction to register maybe a different address or something, it has a way of matching up the reply that comes in with the request.
So on this, we actually clarified the text about what the client does with the reply. There are a few rules about when the client ignores the reply, right? So it verifies the destination address of the reply. It must match the address being registered. It also looking at which address it's actually got response from, right? So I do not think transaction ID would be particularly useful here, but if you think it's going to be useful, yeah, we might say the transaction ID should match. So the client should verify transaction ID when it stops retransmitting, yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look at the text because I think it's, again, I really think you should use the standard communication mechanism, which basically means that the, because the packets may be relayed and things like that, and they should be sent from well, I'll have to go look at it, but I think you got to be careful here that we don't want to change it too much in terms of the communication that's used. And so, that's why the transaction ID is useful, is because if the packet comes in and it comes in from a random location, right, somebody has to know the transaction ID. It's only a 24-bit value, but somebody has to know the transaction ID to like fake a reply if they wanted to do that. Okay, I'm not saying they do, but just if they did. Let me go look at the text again, and I may make some comments on the list. But I think it's best for the client to use this transaction ID. I don't think there's much use for the server to use it, but the server certainly could say, oh, I got the same thing already, I'll ignore it. But most of the time, the server can just process it again and send the reply because it doesn't know whether it doesn't know that the client is retransmitting it because it didn't receive the reply, or that it was just a spurious retransmission, right? So a server will just keep, send a reply for every request it gets, even if it's a duplicate, probably.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah, looking forward to see your comments on the mailing list. Yeah, retransmission mechanism. Yeah, thank you, Bernie. We changed the text back to use the standard retransmission algorithm defined in IETF117. So next slide. Yeah, some cosmetic changes. So Jim did some extensive review and pointed out to some inconsistency in terminology. So we're currently using client consistently instead of end host, device, whatever we were using. We cleaned up the text because it was some duplication and repeating sections. So I hope it's much more readable now, probably even shorter. Next slide. Yeah, surprise slide, which my co-authors have not seen yet. Let me tell you a story. Even if you have, let's say, array guard in the network, there is a possibility that array guard does not work as well as you expected. And somehow, intentionally or accidentally, a host starts sending arrays with some random PIOs, and host starts getting some random addresses. If they are ULAs, you are lucky because global addresses will be preferred, but it might be actual some other prefixes. In this case, the proposed mechanism can be a nice addition for your monitoring system to detect that, oh, hold on, my host is reporting an address which is not appropriate to the network. And currently the draft suggests that server should log such event, which would be like a free benefit in detecting those scenarios. Actually, another scenario when you can see it without even a rogue array is scenario when, for example, subnet changes because of, for example, .1x authentication on wired network and so on, and your hosts are getting addresses which are not expected to have. So basically, I'm saying you get in for free some additional monitoring mechanism to detect configuration issue leading to connectivity. Eric, you wanted to? Okay, yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, so next step. Any more comments, suggestions? I see Bernie is going to help us with transaction ID processing. And the author thinks that the draft is pretty stable, much better than it used to be, I mean, more readable. So maybe, how about working group last call?
Here's my question. Do you guys have any implementations yet of this that exist in the world?
Well, I leave it to my Lawrence. Do you want? I'm a network person.
If we're going to working group last call, I'm curious if there is anything where we've deployed this and have operational experience.
We don't have, I mean, we can do a client implementation, but we don't necessarily have a way to get this into servers. So I don't know what it is that you'd be looking for.
Yeah, it's more just curiosity if we had actually, what we had on the implementation side.
We can definitely put a client implementation together. Yeah, that's what we were planning to do.
Okay.
But and in what form would you like to see that?
It was more just looking for running code, right? Like, hey, has anybody actually tried to implement this, and how has that gone? Type of question was really what I was asking. I think we can get some more comments. Bernie's going to send some, and do all of that. But I was also curious about the running code situation.
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, I will basically see about that, and maybe we can update the list when we have something.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Thanks, Lorenzo.
Eric Vink, what about doing a hackathon in Prague on this? And the mic is very far away from the front row.
It is very far away.
Yeah, we could definitely do it in Prague. I mean, I think one thing that we sort of had considered with this is that you don't actually need to write a DHCP server for this. You can write something that just like listens only for this message type and just logs it. So that's actually, I think we can do that pretty quickly before Prague actually. And yeah, so we can definitely do it in Prague, but I think we could hopefully do it before then.
Okay.
But yes.
Something to think about for the hackathon for sure. Thanks, Eric. It's good.
Yeah, and my impression, the most work will be on the client side, right? The server just picks up the message and logs it, so it doesn't have to be a DHCP server. It could be whatever, like small code, but client needs to do some logic about interfaces and so on.
Go ahead, Tim, and then
Hi.
we'll have Bernie.
Yeah, Tim Chan. So yeah, the most common question I get asked when I'm speaking to universities, as I do pleasantly increasingly more with V6 now, and they're starting to ask good questions, is how do we have the address accountability? So I think anything like this has got to be seen as an advantage to encourage them to deploy and not be worried about that.
Oh, prefix per host.
Don't be naughty. The other thing that they might be concerned about is that, and I think you make the point in the draft, is that if there's a malicious host, then they probably wouldn't send these messages. So they may still scrape switches and routers and so on, as they could do now as well, and then correlate those, I suppose.
Yeah, security consideration, as far as I can remember, does say that it's not like a silver bullet.
Yeah.
You kind of relying on the host to do the right thing. So it's not a really security feature to detect stuff. It's more like monitoring, and yeah, so it should be used with, strictly speaking, I think you can't rely on host from security perspective. You need to get ND cache entry or something, right? Yeah. But it's just an additional mechanism on top of other things, right, to help you. We discussed possibility of letting switches and routers to do something on host behalf. There is a tricky part here, right? You cannot let layer 2 infrastructure to do this because we want the source address to be address being registered, right? Because otherwise it opens another can of worms from security perspective. And switches most likely would not be able to, like, they either have to really spoof the address, right? And most likely it would be really problematic from routing, and you have URPF, for example, on the network, right? Most of my switches would not be able to spoof a client address, right? So it's a bit problematic here. So it's been a discussion in this group, and I believe it's better not to go that direction, right? And let hosts to do this. I don't have really strong opinion, but I'm not sure it's like, so it wouldn't complicate things too much, right?
Yeah. And then, the other question is, it sort of comes up a bit again when I was speaking to universities around registering self-generated addresses in the DNS, to which the answer should be dynamic DNS. Do you think there's any relationship between what you're doing and that, or I don't think there's much use of it as such.
I have deja vu.
Whether there's any need for it, you could also ask.
As far
it's
as
a question I get, so I thought I'd ask it.
As far as I can remember, I joined this work like relatively recently, right? And my understanding, this original draft was talking about DNS, and it was a whole complexity about security of those things, right? Because yeah, now you basically have to trust the host, right, to update DNS, and this completely different like trust relationship. And yeah, I think we should like limit the scope of this draft to DHC. If you do trust your host, you can take this information from your DHCP server, right, and put it in DNS. I think it's completely different, like problem space. And I think Lawrence in the microphone, you'd like to answer to this?
Yeah. So there were some somewhat strong opinions about whether to do this or not, and we just said, well, the client may include the FQDN option in their packet. Yeah. And that was it. And we did, the idea for this actually came from a sort of a large customer that they were like, oh, we need a way to do this. And I said to them, wait a minute, you take the host name from the DHCP request from the client and you stick it in your DNS, and you don't do anything, you don't verify it or anything. They're like, yeah, if they're our employees, if they do something bad, we'll fire them. I was like, I guess. And so apparently people do want to do this, but yeah, so I think in our implementation, we are going to include the whatever host name. And then, yeah, the network is going to do whatever it wants. But yes, for a university, perhaps you might not want to do that. But yes, that's why it's sort of, we didn't want to make any statement in any direction other than to say you could do this.
Yeah, the information is here. How much you trust it, what you want to do with this, it's a different story. And I just think if you start going that direction, it will like complicate things too much in the scope of this draft, right?
I mean, we could say that it should include the FQDN option. I don't know, but then there were strong opinions about that. So
I mean,
My memory of that is there was a previous draft that had gone down this road and
Some-
had not survived the
some of the
DHCP
current
working group.
some of the current authors were instrumental in killing that one. So like I wouldn't necessarily think that that was the problem.
yeah. So, and in the example of the universities I speak to, maybe 20 years ago, they ran their own ISC bind and DNS service, and now they pay Infoblox millions of pounds to do that for them. So I guess these things are kind of related, and that they're going to be running the same company's product that's going to be collecting DHCP information or doing dynamic DNS in practice. So there is it's the same.
The client
thing.
provides you that information, right? Then you can take it and put it in DNS, into log, whatever, right? I don't think the client should have a direct mechanism, like, I don't know what, RPC to DNS server to update it. Well, I guess it's too much to ask, right?
But the nice thing is this could be a very lightweight thing. And as someone said, you don't actually have to run a full DHCP server. You can just run something that collects the messages. So, potentially.
Bernie, did you want to jump in here?
Well, I think Tomek is on vacation, so he's not here. And maybe, maybe rather than building sort of a separate tool, there is the Kia, the ISC Kia server that it might be easy to, it's already got the infrastructure to do all the packet receiving and processing and stuff like that. And maybe it's an easy plug-in to add to that. I don't know. I'm just suggesting it. If Tomek was here, he could probably say more about it. I don't know if there's somebody else from the ISC Kia team that might say anything, but it might be easy to add it to that, right? And the first step may just be to log it, as you said, log it and send the reply. And then, as time goes on, there can be more done with it if that's what the direction is.
Thanks, Bernie. I think that's something we could reach out to him about. Lorenzo?
Tim, sorry, are you suggesting that we should say that the client should include the FQDN, or was it just a question? Because I mean, the working group can definitely say should there. I mean, I think should is fine personally, or must. Well, but yeah, I don't know.
So you'd get those two independent questions that I think they're related about the accountability and being able to put the generated addresses in the DNS. And since most universities are now running commercial products, there are other products available. Maybe I shouldn't just mention one, but they all, they're integrated products that they run as IPANs. Then maybe why not? I guess.
Remember, you probably do not
I
want
don't
to
have
put
a strong opinion. I'm just observing that that's how they run things now.
No,
and
like I think it's better to just give that information and let another tool to deal with it, just because you probably do not want to put everything into DNS, right? You do not want temporary addresses in DNS. You need to be able to actually differentiate between stable. It's getting complicated, right?
So the question then is, why do you want it in the DNS and maybe the reverse DNS? Are there still reasons why that is needed for anything? We could discuss that maybe for some time, but I don't have a strong view. So if you want to leave it as is, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's everything. Anyone else have anything else? All right. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Bernie, am I presenting this or are you? I don't actually know.
That's up to you. I can do it if you want, or you can do it.
Why don't you go ahead and do this, Bernie?
All right. So this is about the RC 8415 biz work that we've been doing, where we're trying to advance DHCP v6 to full internet standard. Can I advance the slides, or there you go?
I didn't give you control, Bernie. I'll just do it from here.
Okay.
See if we can figure it out.
All right. So the third item in our charter, the third main objective was to issue a updated version of the DHCP base specification after an appropriate interval following publication, advance it to internet standard. And so that's what we're trying to do, is follow through on our charter. Next slide. So we did publish two new drafts. The first, or two new versions of the draft. The first one removed the use multicast status code and some of the code around the some of the text around the server checking for multicast versus unicast and stuff, because the only reason it was doing that was so it could send the use multicast status code under the appropriate situation. So we obsoleted that code because, as you may remember, we are removing the server unicast capability and the option and the capability. And so this was a remnant of that capability that if a client unicasted a message that it shouldn't have, we could then send it, the server could then send it a use multicast status code to say, hey, you know, you can't do this, you got to send it the multicast way. Is there a question? Or do you want to wait until the end of the slide? What?
Keep going, Bernie.
Okay.
It's going to be about the next slide.
And Tomek also, oops, no, go back. Tomek also added an implementation status section. Again, this is just intended for the ISG evaluation process, and you know, it has a note that it should be removed by the RFC editor when an RFC is produced, because it doesn't survive RFC status. You know, there's no need for that information because it's stale information as soon as it's published. Comments and corrections are very welcome for that section. So if you notice anything that's wrong or implementations that are missing, please let us know so that we can update that in the near future. We are also going to ask our AD and our document shepherd, who is Suresh, and for them to review this section, because they're both on the ISG, and so we want to see, you know, if what we have here is sufficient or what more may be needed. All right, next slide. Okay, so what's left? There was some discussion on the working group mailing list recently about a misbehaving PD client, prefix allocation client, that would release an address, a delegated prefix when it was still in use, or addresses that might have been, you know, the prefix that might have been assigned to a link, and router advertisements that might have been sent out to clients had not yet expired. And so it was very possible that clients were still using addresses, and the PD client, you know, which was a sort of like a home router or whatever, released the address, released the prefix when it shouldn't have. So you know, there's a lot of operational issues that are not fully discussed in the RFC. Now, we could add a section, and Michael Richardson had proposed a short little paragraph that we could add to address this particular issue in like the prefix allocation section. But you know, the other question is that there's a lot of new work that's been done. There's 2 RFCs that have been published that provide a lot more operational information. I don't recall the RFC numbers right off the top of my head, but there's 2 RFCs that have been written that provide a lot of the operational things, and these were post RFC 8415. So one of the questions is, should we reference as informational those documents? It's possible that there might be some downref issues, but I think if we leave them informational references, they won't. They don't necessarily cover this particular issue in full, but it's pretty close. Tim, did you want to add something?
No, there's people at the mic. They're not in the queue though, Bernie. I don't know if you can see them, so I'm going to let them
I
ask
can
some
see.
questions.
Yes,
Okay,
go ahead.
perfect.
Okay, Aaron Cudbart-Bell for Radius Project. So I always want to raise the questions on the mailing list about the poorly behaved CEs. So one of the key things here, it's RFC 9096 is the one with recommendations, and there's 2 paragraphs that would solve the majority of problems. The first states that a CE performing DHCP6 PD should not release its prefix delegation when it reboots, which would solve the sort of flash cut issue that we have at the moment. And the second recommendation is that reconfigures are essentially sent to all the downstream LAN DHCP clients if anything changes or the prefix changes. And that would solve 2 issues. It would, firstly, if DHCP v6 options change in the prefix delegation, at the moment they don't propagate downwards in a timely way. That's the first thing it would solve. And the second thing it would solve would be flash cutting and the downstream clients having an incorrect prefix. So you could include an informational reference, but given the very limited scope of the text, I think it would just be easier to move it into the document, because it's a really big issue. I mean, one of the points raised on the mailing list was no one uses dynamic prefixes, but 9096 says that 37% of responding ISPs employ dynamic IPv6 prefixes from the UK Network Operators Forum survey. So it's obviously in use. And maybe one of the reasons why this hasn't come up before is because when end users have a problem, they just disable IPv6.
Well, no, I mean, what I've been seeing with this is that a lot of CPEs do not do PD on the LAN side, right? There's a draft about this. This is not a commonly deployed thing, which is why I do not think it's the massive problem that it will be when people start to turn that on. So I hear that. For the 8415 part of this, I have mixed feelings on this, because CPEs are special and people go read those drafts, and those CPEs have always had special RFCs to specify their specific requirements, and it's different than something like an 8415 client would do in an enterprise, for example. So I'm tempted to say what Bernie said and said we should put informative references that CPEs should go read this stuff, because there's no point in having a generic 8415 client do some of these things. So I hear what you're saying. I know I agree at one point, but at the same time, I'm also leery of messing with 8415 regular stuff. But I do. Bernie, I'm sure you have more comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think, there's a good argument to be made to reference the newer RFCs, because obviously 8415 predates 1996. And so, providing readers of whatever the, DHCP v6 RFC to be is information about other documents that they should go look at in specific cases, I think is a good thing to do. And I think they should just be informational documents. So that's just my opinion. But I think this is something we're going to discuss with our AD a little bit further and figure out what we'll also discuss it on the mailing list. But the idea is that we want to be careful about how much we add to it, because if we add a lot of text, we may end up, having a big set of big debates about it, and we'll also need a justification for why we did this. It's pretty easy to justify. We added references to newer operational RFCs that had been published since 8415 was published. I think that's pretty easy to tell people, these are operational documents that you should go look at if you're going to implement a specific device, such as a CPE.
Yeah, and I tend to agree. It's just there's recommendations of preferred and valid lifetime clamping already in there for prefix delegation. It seems like all this stuff is absolutely in the same vein. Like, there is no real distinction between the recommendations send a reconfigure message and recommendations not to hand out leases that last longer than your prefix delegation. But I'll raise a PR and you can see how small the text is, and then maybe we can have a discussion about it, because it's really not significant.
Yeah, do that. Send it to the list, and we can review it.
Okay. My other point was actually about the previous slide. So I'm wondering why unicast, the unicast option was deprecated, because there seems to be an outstanding issue with DHCP-v6 when you're using it with relays, in that you have to send all packets to every upstream DHCP server. There's no mechanism described for filtering based on server ID. And removing the unicast options sort of seems to make this worse, because now there's absolutely no way of sending directed packets towards servers.
Well, in most of the scenarios where relays are involved, the relays want to add stuff because often the server needs that additional information. This was this was one of the huge architectural changes we made when we did DHCP-v6, was to make communication always go through the relay. We did provide the out with a server unicast option to bypass that, but in the days of DHCP-v4, where clients would send renewal requests directly to the server, that caused all sorts of funny problems in a lot of operational networks that relied on that relay information being there, which wasn't. And so, I don't know how much the server unicast option is really used in the field. From all the information we have, it's hardly ever used. And in fact, I think you mentioned it, or somebody on that discussion mentioned that there are relays that actually remove that option if it appears in the client, and the message is going to go to the client, right?
Yeah, the sponsor of this conference, actually, their equipment removes it, the 7750s, sort of defeating it completely. Okay, that's a fair reason to remove it then. I think maybe as part of next steps, it would be good to have discussion around making the transmission of packets that could be unicast from relays more efficient, because there's other things as well, like server ID appears at a random place in the packet, and that's what you need to filter incoming requests coming into the DHCP-v6 server. So you have to do a complete branching decode of the packet before you can filter it. So anyway, used lots of time. I'll do that.
Thanks. Eric?
Yeah, like Michael asked, Eric, the AD, like Michael asked on the chat about this slide. So obviously any documents can make an informative reference to informational draft or whatever. But the thing, the don't write first only happens when you have a normative reference to an informational document. There's nothing links about newer or after. So that should be clear. Now, the real question really whether those documents will be normative or informative, right? And for this, I mean, we just discussed this about this morning, right? So I need to read the document and to check whether those new documents are really normative or informational.
Okay. Thanks, Eric.
Okay. Thank you. I think there's, so next steps, we have to clean up these last little issues about improving the text. There's a few minor typos that we'll also need to fix. But, we hope that the 03 may be the last one, but you never know. So tentatively, I'd like to do this sooner. I'd like to actually, I'm hoping that we can get this done so that we can send the document to the ISG before IETF 118, but this is one maybe more realistic schedule given the amount of work left and getting people to review the changes. All right, that's it.
Thanks, Bernie. I think that's it for today, right? That was everything. Okay. If anyone doesn't have any other business, then I guess we can conclude the DHCP working group. We've got, like we said, we've got two working group drafts ongoing. They both presented today, which is great. Send comments to the list, follow up on all the great stuff. Thanks, Ben, for taking notes, and thanks everyone for being here. Oh, we got some questions. Go ahead, Lorenzo. Sorry.
Sorry.
I was looking down.
So just sort of a, I don't know, maybe process question. So we have this V6 up stock, which is talking about how to do DHCPD
Yeah.
on sort of broadcast networks, and do sort of also like gearing up to try to get some document in 6-man adopted on how to, on how to signal availability of DHCPD. Just wanted to say, how do we get folks in this group to sort of maybe take a look and make sure that, should we just like send it to
Yeah, I
the
would.
list and...
Yeah, for the draft that I'm working on, I send it to Snack for the same reason. I have the
Yeah.
same problem. And B6 Ops is where it's living, but another working group needs to stare at the stuff. So I would totally just CC us on the next version of this, and we'll go take a look. You're right. I don't think we've had any traffic. I get confused I'm on both mailing lists,
Yeah,
but I don't think we've had any DHC traffic on that draft. So that's probably a good idea, Lorenzo.
So I think one of them we're gonna ask for, I think V6 Ops last call this week. So then in that case, we should definitely go here, and we should send it here as well. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
It's a great idea. Okay, now this time for real. Does anyone have anything else they want to chat about? Okay. Thanks, everybody. End of the meeting. Thank you so much.
Take care.